You're listening to sermons from La Cañada Congregational Church and Pastor Kyle Sears. Join us in person every Sunday at 10 a.m. in La Cañada for worship. You can find more information about our church online at lacañadachurch.org.
So when Erica and I were dating, we were flipping through old family photos at her grandmother's house. And she knew a lot of the people in those pictures. To me, most of the faces and names just kind of swam into and out of focus as we would turn the pages. And I'd catch maybe a bit of story or context here and there, but for the most part, just people I didn't know. But what makes this a memorable experience is that toward the end, it was page after page of dead people. And I'm not meaning like pictures of people who had lived so long ago they were dead. I mean open caskets and dead people in these pictures. And yeah, it was weird. I asked her if I could tell this story. The photo album captured the full breadth of their experience from birth to death. And the opening of Matthew's gospel is kind of like that, like flipping through a family photo album of somebody else's. Like, I know some of these names and faces, but most of these people are just dead people as far as I can tell. You might perk up at a name or here as I'm about to read through about, several generations of this family. But most of these people have been lost to time, literally, outside of being named here in this passage. So let's read them. This is Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 17. An account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac was the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Aram, and Aram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah. And Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah, and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Salathiel, and Salathiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiad, and Abiad the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Messiah. Woo! I intentionally did not practice those. So don't trust my reading of that. But Matthew continues on, all the generations from Abraham to David, 14 generations. From David to the deportation in Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. Now, when people say that the Bible is boring, I think they mean passages like this. Why on earth would I choose this? But really the question to be asked is, why would Matthew decide to start this compelling story about the Son of God born among us with what would amount to like a slideshow of your in-laws? Why would he begin this story like this? If you notice, his openings sound a lot like the beginnings of other stories in Israel's history, namely the bits and pieces of Genesis that we skip over, and the bits and pieces in Numbers that we tend to skip over, and some of those other parts in Isaiah and Ezekiel that we tend to skip over. Stories of the lineage that's found in creation and with Abraham and with David. Matthew is starting his story in this way to show how this origin story of Jesus is rooted in history. And this history features David and Abraham and will somehow continue the legacies and promises made to those two. Abraham has been called by God to bless the world, to become the family that would then make God's presence known to all the earth, binding himself and his lineage to God in this covenant through circumcision. And this promise is one of mutual faithfulness, that God will be faithful to Abraham and Abraham's family just as Abraham will be faithful to God. And that all who participate in this family will be bound together, united across time and space with this first promise that was made to a childless couple. And even though the family stumbles their way forward, Isaac and Jacob continue this promise, as well as the other names we hear. And as we bridge this gap between Abraham and David, there are some strange elements mixed in, elements that don't really belong in genealogies like this from this time. And mostly it's the inclusion of 3 women. That's kind of a weird thing to add. And specifically, 3 foreign-born women. Matthew seems to make an early statement hidden in this genealogy saying that Jesus fails to uphold any sense of pure blood ancestry. That central to the call of Abraham is the inclusion of other nations, of outsiders and even enemies into this story. You may have heard the name Tamar mentioned. If you get bored during this sermon, crack open Genesis 38. You won't be bored. It is a scandalous story filled with deception and prostitution and incest as strong themes throughout. Rahab, too, mentioned in this, is a prostitute who saves Israel from the forces in Jericho. And Ruth is a forgotten daughter-in-law, an enemy Moabite woman who is redeemed and saved and brought into the lineage of King David. And with David, we have this mighty warrior and psalmist, one after God's own heart, we're told. But Matthew immediately reminds us of this scandal with Bathsheba, how this cowardly murder of her husband Uriah by the hand of David, this trusted friend, that this too is built within the story of Jesus. That most of the kings mentioned that come following David were failures and met by this historical refrain throughout the book of Kings: they did evil before the eyes of the Lord. That there is nothing to look back and say, what a guy just continuing on like David, that guy that killed a lot of people. These names cry out for redemption as we read king after king in this story. Because evil has been inflicted upon the land and its people, hoping, though, that somehow in this story there would be a silver lining to come. That somehow God would restore faithfulness before everything goes sideways. By naming David and the story of David's family, we hear the echoes of hope that God would provide someone to extend the promises of that lineage, to return as an anointed one, a Messiah, a Christ. That within naming David, we sense that the world needs a king who would not be a tyrant, who would not be selfish, who would not be aimed at their own wealth and power, but instead one who would lay down their very life for the sake of the world. And so I want to say, as we look back at Jesus' family story, we find in a way that all of our stories are like this. As kids, my brothers and I would sometimes cringe when someone said, "Oh, you look just like your dad," because that's the last thing we wanted to look like. I don't want to be associated with him. I have to share his name, but beyond that, please don't say I look anything like him, because if I look like him, then do I also act like him? The scandalous whispers around town made me want to move away as far as possible. And yet we were his sons. In college, I actually spent time trying to trace my family ancestry back to something redemptive. I got back pretty far. There was 2, my mom's maiden name is Skidmore. There was 2 Skidmores way back there in English history. One were knights and one were farmers. Guess which one I came from? Farmers 1,000 years ago, farmers still today. But looking to the future, you see, I hope that somehow my children are protected from the unfulfilled promises made to my dad and his dad before him and so on. That somehow there will be a change that would rewrite the story of pain and abandonment and loss into something fruitful and lovely. And so Matthew doesn't flinch from the parts of the story that maybe bring up our own sense of shame within our family stories. That Jesus is designated in the opening lines with what would be the title of how Matthew would title his story as the son of Abraham and the son of David, and all of the mess that comes with that. This has very little to do with that genetic makeup of Jesus. He's got David's chin and Abraham's eyes. Instead, what he's saying is it's about the inheritance of these abiding hopes that the people carry with them in their bodies, this unfulfilled expectation that God's renewal will come. It's a royal listing, except it's interrupted by these ignoble men and women that have some been forgotten to the time of history, but God refuses to strike those names from our memory. In the middle of this opening scene, we get this mention of the deportation to Babylon, and it sounds like they just packed their bags and went somewhere else for a while, but instead, what we are reminded is this is the lowest of the low point in the story of Israel. That the last king is forced to watch his children be executed one by one before he is blinded, so that that's the last thing he sees before he's carted off to Babylon. Him and the remainder of the people, with only a remnant left behind to fight over the smallhold farms and cities before it's burned to the ground itself. And built within that painful memory is how generations will find their children learning and singing Babylonian songs, craving Babylonian food, dating Babylonian boys and naming their children with Babylonian names, that somehow things went wrong and messed up all of this, and yet within that story, Christ is born. Most of the most recent elements of Jesus' lineage are the names that we have forgotten the fastest, because of the pain that has left us there. And I think this points to why we need a new story, why we long for a new story to be told. That Matthew hopes to show that for all the bitterness of these memories, God stays true to what God has promised. When they were in Babylon, God promised them a future and a hope, a promise to return to the land, a promise of comfort, of forgiveness of sins. And each of us needs a new beginning, but what happens is that Matthew does not want us to forget the story that came before that got us into this mess to begin with. This is a thoroughly Jewish story and therefore a thoroughly human story. That the longings and desperations of them are the same longings and desperations we each carry. The hope held in spite of all the evidence is where Jesus arrives. And so we should expect Jesus' story, if it begins this way, to continue this way, with twists and turns and unexpected subversions. The story of Jesus is also going to include the subversive and the scandalous. Okay, y'all have heard me say this before. There are two Christmas songs that I just don't like. And they're the popular ones, Away in a Manger and Silent Night. And it's mostly because of this attitude, and you've all had children. Silent Night? Come on. That's not true. But little Lord Jesus, no crying he makes? Come on. He was a baby. Now, we're going to be singing these songs because it so happens that our musicians like this sort of stuff. But maybe we should be singing, Sleepless Night, Holy Night, instead of Silent Night. Because we need to imagine Jesus coming to us not as a God would arrive. Because if we imagine Jesus coming to us as a God would arrive, then we strip that story from all of its human connection. Having Jesus arrive in a surprising way as God, teaching not quite like a prophet, behaving not quite like a rabbi, not ascending to popularity quite like a king. Something is different within this story. Jesus upends our imaginations of what God is like, and yet we as Christians say that this is the best picture of God that we have. This baby from scandalous backgrounds and scandalous birth with scandalous friends and a scandalous death is the way we imagine who God is and who God calls us to be. So we don't have to look back 14 or 28 or 42 generations to find our own scandalous stories. We carry our own shameful memories with us, memories that we may suspect would prevent us from being welcome to hear the story of Jesus, or to imagine ourselves there at the manger or the cross or the empty tomb. And yet the story tells us from its opening lines that there is no other place where we are more welcome, because we stand shoulder to shoulder with terrible kings and family members that were once called enemies. Recall the end of this opening prologue, 3 sets of generations spanning 14 names each, a trilogy, if you will, with Jesus being the beginning of this new storyline. And within each section, 2 sets of 7, 2 weeks in the cycle of history, 7 is important in the way we would tell the story. And so we have 6 sets of 7, meaning also that this birth of Christ is Saturday, is Sabbath, is rest, is when God does something new. This is the time of Advent where we find the Sabbath of all Sabbaths, the ultimate source of God's rest and presence, of God's renewal and forgiveness, of salvation and redemption. This is the day of Christ's birth where we find that all the past is forgiven. In moments throughout Matthew's story, we will find Jesus calling his followers brothers and sisters, family somehow remade where we get to be included. And so this ancient story of calling and rebellion and return back to the land is also part of our story now. And for all the times that we might need a new birth, a fresh start, a place of rest, and the welcome of God, this story of Jesus becomes our story. It is within Advent where we long for this coming of God, this hope of our salvation. So I hope that we would find the gracious welcome of God given to us in this wandering tale that we call life. And that may our own wandering even lead us to find the beauty of God in Jesus, the son of Abraham, the son of David. Amen.